I had my hands full, and for once it was due to family instead of work. After getting in contact with my sister's ex-boyfriend, who started raising 2 of her kids, he invited me over. I couldn't get over how big those 2 got while I was off setting up my pie farm. I couldn't pick them up without their feet almost touching the ground, but we still tried. I regretted all the time we spent away from each other. Now that I hired Tippy, I could abuse his talent for transportation spells to see them whenever I wanted. On the last case, I had found out what kind of state my sister was in. She'd hidden a lot from everyone, including a newborn whom we made the hard choice to adopt out to a supernatural couple. I needed to tell Brian and the kids about it. Introducing them went as well as could be expected. Very confused at first. Then everyone stared in stunned silence at the 2 very not human creatures standing in front of them. I wanted them all to be involved in each other's lives, and for the kids to not miss out on seeing their half-sister. After the shock wore off, Jessie started to ask about things that any 14-year-old who just found out the supernatural was real would ask. She demanded to know about vampires. That turned into a very long conversation. I stayed with them for a few days, very glad to see everyone getting along. When the visit was over, I realized I didn't even notice that Nick hadn't responded to any of the messages I'd sent the past few days. I just texted him about how well the introductions went, along with some photos of everyone. Even on busy jobs, he normally sent at least a one-word reply to show he'd seen the messages. A day passed after I got home and still no word from my partner. My phone rang constantly for other things, so many messages and calls from family or work, but still no Nikki. I soon broke down and called Abarash, a pit of dread in my stomach. It really wasn't like him to not text back for this long. Maybe his phone was broken, or maybe one of the dogs ate it. They did have a habit of chewing things they shouldn't. If I didn't keep my thoughts light, I would sink into a panic that wouldn't help anyone. When she also didn't answer, I called again. She thankfully picked up on the second ring, unaware of the storm she just walked into. "Are you that desperate for a date?" she asked with a small laugh. "Yes, but that's besides the point. Nikki hasn't answered in a few days and I'm worried. Can you check on him at his place? I can't get there on my own," I said with a hint of panic in my voice. There was a long pause as she considered what I just asked. "It's cute that you care about your partner so much, but are you really sure this is something to worry about? Why don't we give him some more time? I'm positive this is nothing. We can go out tonight," she offered, trying to ease my worries. "I would love that, but it's been a pretty long time already. This isn't like him. When you figure out where he is, we can go on 100 dates. Any place you like." I started pacing my apartment, unaware that my hand nervously went to touching my bad ear. It was a new habit to feel the scar while thinking. "All right, I'll hold you to that. 100 dates it is. You're paying, and there is a great place I've wanted to go to that serves crab legs as long as your arm. Nick is probably just still on a case. I'll look into where he went last and tell you what's up." I thanked her a few times and let her go. My stomach twisted so badly I needed to sit down where I stood lest I throw up. That switched into laying in the middle of my kitchen and staring up at the ceiling waiting for her to call back. I wanted to think about going on fancy dinner dates with the world's most beautiful woman, but the fact that Nick could be missing completely overtook my line of thought. For the first time in days, my phone stayed silent. Waiting was agony. Every minute I checked the time, it felt like an hour had passed. I couldn't stand not knowing if a person I cared about was all right or not. If Nick just lost his phone, he would hear an earful from me. If he didn't and was hurt, I would never forgive myself. He did so many cases without me. It felt like a miracle something like that hadn't happened yet. Something dawned on me as I was on the floor, staring up at my dusty ceiling I've neglected to clean since I moved in. If I stopped answering my phone, there would be a pretty decent amount of people worried. I've never reflected on that. Tears started to come to my eyes as the weight of caring so deeply about others along with being cared for finally sinking in. My phone buzzed and I sat up so fast I got dizzy. Abarash called, my fingers shaking so bad that it took a few tries to even answer the phone. "Is everything all right?" I asked quickly. "Sweetie, we're not sure of where Nick is." Her voice trembled slightly on the other end. The floor fell out from under me. I almost fainted. Without knowing what I was doing, I stood up to head to the door as if I could just go out and find him. Abarash started speaking again to get my attention. She knew how I would react to news like this and needed to get ahead of it. "Listen, sit tight. I'll be by your place in a few minutes. We'll figure this out together." As I waited, I grabbed what I thought I might need. A jacket, my handgun, and my wallet. If Nick was on a case, he could be hurt somewhere. Someone should have noticed this before now. Anger at the corporation bubbled in my stomach. How did they not know one of their agents hadn't checked in for a few days? Was he on a secret job or a dangerous one? What the hell happened? Abarash didn't even knock. She just opened the apartment door, heat and sunlight flooding inside. I wasn't in the right state of mind to ditch my jacket as I rushed out. A set of steep stone steps leading down to a beach stretched out in front. I nearly slipped on the sandy steps and Abarash caught my hand. With her help, we flew down them, racing towards a small rowboat at a half-rotten wooden dock. I jumped inside the boat, still not aware of what was going on. Abarash stayed on the dock to untie the rowboat, tossing the rope inside it. I checked the case logs. Nick and another agent were assigned to investigate some sort of disturbance in the cave over there. She pointed off to the sea and to a small island off in the distance. It was either very small or very far away. This rowboat being so small, it sunk close to the water with only my weight. Abarash would put us under if he stepped inside it. She stayed on the dock, looking down with clear worry on her face, her jewelry reflecting light onto the lapping water. A patterned scarf was tied around her head crooked, as if she'd gotten ready in a hurry. Klein, the agent Nick was with, submitted a report. It was only when you brought it up that we noticed Nick hadn't checked in. I can't go with you. I barely had enough time to get you here. Just look inside the cave. Any sign of danger, leave. It'll give me enough of a reason to duck out from work. Skylar, don't worry. We'll find him. I was about to ask more questions when she leaned down to silence our conversation with a kiss, a tactical move on her part. My brain went completely blank as she pushed the side of the boat with her foot to cause it to start to drift away. I'd gotten so worked up about Nick, I would have made mistakes. She got me back on track by embarrassing the hell out of me. My face reddened while the distance between us grew. I'll bring him back. Then we can go out for dinner. I called out to her. The boat must be magic. Without anyone rowing or a motor running, it started to pick up speed. You'd better come back safe. You both mean the world to me. She shouted back over the sounds of the waves. The oncoming waves nearly knocked me out of the boat. I kept looking in her direction for as long as I could. Nick didn't talk much about his relationships with others. Aside from mentioning he knew someone, he never said how he felt about them. He gave Abarash any leftovers whenever he cooked, but never said how far back they went. From what I could gather, they had known each other for a while. She had met his last partner at least. Abarash needed to take samples from him for work, but at least she cared about him more than most. The salty air stung my eyes as the boat nearly flew across the water. It skidded across the sandy beach, only stopping when the front dug into the shore. I held on for dear life when the small boat practically crash-landed onto the island. My knees were shaking, but I stood, forcing them to move. Armed with only a regular handgun, I was ready to race into danger trying to find whatever had happened to Nick. The island looked barely large enough to hold the cave opening. Sharp rocks jutted off on either side of the tiny 5-step-wide beach. The tide had already started to rise. I touched my pocket to feel for my phone. Any sign of danger and I needed to call for help. I knew that, and yet would I really go back without Nikki? Gun drawn, I walked up the beach to the entrance of the cave. I only paused to take off my jacket and tie the sleeves around my waist. The bright sunlight poured inside, making it easy to see. Water reflected dancing lights against the rocks. A place like this should be on a postcard or someone's desktop background. It did not look threatening in the slightest, but something had happened in here. I wish I was told more information about what kind of agent Nick had been last paired with or even where the hell I was. I literally went in blind. Rocks covered the ground, making it hard to walk in a straight line. When I wasn't careful enough, they snagged my pants and nearly cut through them. From the look of how small the island was, this cave should have ended quickly. Instead, it just kept going in a slight incline. At least the sharp, larger rocks evened out to smaller ones at a certain point, making it easier to walk. Holes in the ceiling let sunlight pour through. I remained alert, expecting almost anything. When sounds of footsteps along those smaller rocks came down the cave tunnel, I ducked behind a large rock and waited. I raised my gun and peeked around to see what came closer. My mouth dropped open when the creature walked under a beam of light and sniffed the air. The face looked crooked and set on the body of a large bird. A long tail dragged along behind, but instead of having tail feathers, it looked as if it should belong to a rat. Another creature came, and it had mixed features as well. A bird's bottom half, but with a woman's torso and a face with rat and human features that were set all wrong in the skull. Both wheezed as if they couldn't take in air properly. These two should simply not be alive. The plan was to let them move along or sneak by, but that did not happen. I ducked down too late from being shocked by the creature's appearances, and the bird-looking creature noticed me first. Emitting a cackling sound, it started to run towards me. I stood up behind the rock, firing at its head. The body slammed against my shield, dead from either crashing headfirst into the rock or from one of my bullets. There wasn't enough time for me to react to the second creature, so it was on top of me by the time I turned. It forced all of its weight down on my chest. The rocks were jabbing into my back, cutting through my shirt. Clawed hands grabbed at my face and knocked away my only weapon. My body acted on its own and my hand landed on a large, sharp rock. The creature started to wrap their long fingers around my throat just as I slammed the rock against the creature's temple, the sharp end driving into the weak skull. The entire body slumped down, crushing the air from my chest. By sheer luck, I had killed the monster before it killed me, but had also nearly died from being crushed by the dead weight. with more cuts along my back. I wriggled out from under the body. Breathing hard, I stood there staring down at what I had just killed, unable to understand what they were. These things were creepy as hell, but as weak as a human. My hands shook as I grabbed my gun. There most likely were more of these creatures further inside. I could leave and call for backup, delaying finding Nick, or keep going. I still had a weapon. When I ran out of bullets or became outnumbered, I would call for help. My cell phone stopped working the moment I walked inside the cave, showing me there was some sort of magic messing with it. I would need to leave the cave for it to work again. Another creature came into the light, a head made of two different conjoined ones, a human and a bird. The body had one useless wing poking out from its side. A human torso was connected to a feathered large rodent body. I saw red the moment I noticed it wore a suit jacket. There was no way to know if it was Nick's or not. The creature's claws were caked with blood. I could think of nothing except that my partner could be somewhere in here, seriously hurt. The thing noticed me and probably thought I was a fresh meal. I charged at it at the same time it screeched and ran at me for an attack. These creatures were nothing like anything I'd met before. There was no light behind their eyes. They only wanted to cause harm, nothing more. My attention so focused on the one wearing the jacket that I didn't see the rest of the monsters coming down the cave. Firing off a few shots, the monster fell after 5 hits to the human face. Toppling over, another one took its place. I was unable to check the suit jacket pockets for Nick's notebook or any sign that it belonged to him. The other monster was nearly on top of me. Taking a risk, I shoved my hand inside its open mouth and fired my gun. It made a garbled sound and I yanked my hand free, covered in blood and spit. In the few seconds that passed, there were now far too many to deal with. I would run out of bullets and running away would be no longer an option. I needed to save as much ammo as I could. One swooped in trying to take a chunk out of my arm. Turning, I wrapped an arm around the long skinny neck and put a hand on the head to keep it still. With all the strength I could muster, I put pressure on the neck until I heard a deadly crack. I hated killing these things. It didn't feel right. It felt like I was killing some sort of animal gone feral by no fault of their own. After I let the dead one drop, I still had the feeling of its neck cracking in my arms. I got ready for another creature to attack, but prepared it all for the one that came charging out between the other monsters. Its head down low as it ran and its long beak out in front. My body reacted too slowly and the creature's beak easily stabbed through my stomach, sending my brain into instant shock. It lifted my body off the ground and tossed aside, until it rolled to a stop. I landed on my back, gasping for the air that had been knocked from my lungs, while my hand found its way down to my wound. The beak had left a gaping hole that was bleeding profusely. It was a miracle that none of my organs had slid out from being tossed around. Feeling numb, I tried to put pressure on the wound, as if that would help. The sounds of those creatures started to fade as the edge of my vision grew hazy. My hands started to feel cold. Then soon the rest of my limbs started to become chilled. I always knew I would die on one of these cases. I cursed myself for doing so before I found Nick. It was such a terrible time to die too. I had family and other people who cared about me waiting for me to come back. I couldn't bleed to death in some random cave in the middle of nowhere. In that moment, I found myself not thinking back much on my life, but instead trying to bring up the memories of the few times Nick smiled and wanting nothing more than to see it again. A voice dragged me back from the darkness. The voice belonged to someone I knew but I couldn't match to a face. I didn't understand what they were trying to say. A hand so large that it nearly covered my entire stomach was placed on top of my wound. The person wanted my other hand, barely able to raise it. I lifted a numb and blood-covered hand up. Someone grabbed it, placing a thumb into my palm. A thumb tipped with a claw. "This shall hurt," a deep voice said without pity. That was an understatement. Death would have been kinder. Pain ripped through my body and traveled along my veins. My legs kicked trying to get away from it, but I was pinned down by the massive hand. I made grooves in the rocks from kicking and thrashing. If I screamed, I don't remember hearing my own voice. It felt as if something was entering the wound, shooting through my blood and exiting my body out of my palm. Whoever did this would get a very stern talking to when, or if, I recovered. Finally, after an eternity of pain, my mind sank into darkness. A dripping sound woke me, and then I heard feet walking across the gravel toward me. I rolled over, body stiff and everything still in pain. My vision blurry as I looked up, expecting to see another threat. I was staring at a creature, but not one I ever thought would be inside this cave. "What are you?" I croaked, unable to get the rest of the words out. Ankir stood, arms turned into furry claws, his hands cupped together. Without a word, he opened his hands to splash cold water on my head. I sputtered, getting some in my nose. It didn't taste salty and I wondered where he found fresh water. Sitting up felt like a chore. My one hand burned, the palm sloppily wrapped up. Carefully, I raised my torn and bloodied shirt to look over the wound, and I saw that it was already healed over in a scar. That shouldn't be possible. My body would have been overloaded from the magic. Or I had to have slept for days to be this healed. Was I sleeping for that long? If so, was Nick found already? I got up on uneven legs, ready to try and get some questions answered. When I stood, I saw I had been laying on a folded-up suit jacket. It was so large it might as well be a tent, making it clear that it belonged to Ankar. I never would have thought he would be the type to be thoughtful enough to do such a thing. What happened? How long was I out? I asked, stumbling forward. An hour and not long enough. Stay down, human. What are you even doing here in the first place? He growled, turning to face me. He looked a little different from when I saw him last. His sleeves were rolled up to make room for his massive arms. His reddish hair turned into a mane circling his neck and traveling down his chest. His dress shirt was torn open and his pant legs were torn at the knees so his thick legs, which were also covered in fur, could move freely. I thought he might have some cat-like legs to match his mane, but instead they were more stumpy, like a bear's. Poking through his long hair was a set of round ears on top of his head that I had never noticed before. God damn it, those round ears were a little bit cute. How dare he? Bodies of the creatures were littered around, torn apart. He made killing them look easy. Did you heal me? I asked, looking around at the gore. My eyes landed on the trail of blood I left when I bounced off the ground. My hands started to tremble at the sight. I had really almost died. It had happened so many times before, but now the evidence was left behind staining those rocks for years. Yes, the process was difficult. I moved the magic out of your body before you became overloaded, while using it to heal at the same time. As far as I am aware, I am the only one in the corporation who is able to do such a thing. Aside from that, what are you doing here? He asked. Ankar walked over while he spoke, his figure looming over the very small human in his path. My head didn't even reach half his height. He must have grown taller when he half transformed. He honestly looked more threatening than any of the creatures inside this cave system. Nick is my partner. Of course, I'm here. Why are you here? I asked again, getting worked up. Nicholas is my agent and my responsibility. You need to leave. There is nothing a small, weak human like yourself can do here. Reaching down to make his point, he pressed a single finger down on the top of my head, forcing me to look at the ground. The sight of my own dried blood on the gravel nearly made me sick. If he didn't show up at the right time, I would be dead. I strained against his finger, finding it too strong to move my head an inch, teeth grinding together. I hated him in that moment as much as I hated myself. I couldn't do much. My gun was nearly empty and I didn't have another weapon to kill those monsters if I became cornered again. I was only useful for one thing: if we found my partner. I need to find him. He needs someone who can make him smile after all of this. The finger lifted from my head. Ankar's face dropped in an expression of surprise. I didn't blame him. None one really thought Nick could smile. I doubted it myself until I saw it. Oddly enough, that answer was enough. My only real strength simply supporting my partner. I rarely did much else on our cases. Ankar sounded like one of the most powerful people in the corporation. No doubt he would do fine on his own. He would be useless comforting a scared or hurt Nick though. I wouldn't even be able to tell if Nick was upset when he did find him. Thank you for saving me, I said, feeling slightly guilty for getting mad at him for pointing out my faults. His face flushed. For a second, his hand hovered as if he was going to smack me upside the head. Ankar really didn't know how to deal with people being nice to him. Stomping away, he focused on the dead bodies of the creatures he killed earlier. This jacket belongs to Klein, the agent we sent with Nicholas. We do not understand why he would send a report stating that the job was finished when there are still creatures in this cave, Ankar said as he started to try and take the bloody jacket off of the broken corpse. The sleeve ripped off and he gave up, growling in frustration. Walking over to where he left his jacket, he grabbed it to toss over my face. Wear that and leave. The suits are woven with magic to protect the agents wearing them. The more important the agent, the stronger the protection is. I struggled to get the oversized jacket off my head, practically swimming in the fabric. It seems to me that the stronger jackets should be given to weaker agents to protect them if they couldn't do it themselves. I didn't bring it up, fearing an argument. I told you, I'm not leaving. I need to stay to find. My words got cut off by Ankar storming over, teeth showing in a rage. His voice echoing through the cave, not caring who or what would hear. Are you useless? How do you think Nick would feel if you died trying to find him? Do you not really put your partner's feelings into consideration in the slightest? I should have been intimidated by the yelling and how frightening Ankar was when angry, but I caught on to something he wouldn't want people to notice. He wasn't acting like a worried boss, but rather a cornered father figure. You called him Nick, I pointed out. It was such a minor thing and yet so important. Being called out on his mistake caused him to turn red again. His fur puffed up like a house cat. He stormed off, cursing the entire time, kicking at the bodies along the way. Nick never mentioned Ankar and him being close. I never would have assumed such a thing would be possible if it wasn't for the outburst. I let him fume long enough to calm down. At least he was taking his anger out on something already dead. You'll die if you continue along on these cases. After we find him, give up. Stop with this nonsense and live a human life. You do not belong here. he said, not even turning to meet my eyes. Glancing at the trail of blood and my torn shirt, I knew he yet again was right. I would die on one of these cases. It was a matter of time before my luck ran out. I belong with him, I replied firmly. For a very long time, I assumed there was only romantic love when it came to others who weren't your family. I never fully understood the statement when someone said they loved someone like a brother. After working with Nick, it was clear just how much I could care about another person without wanting to date them. He wasn't just a friend. I would gladly die for him, even if I didn't want him to suffer through that. He deserved to have someone who cared for him working alongside him on the hard cases. Someone who didn't see him as a tool to be used. My suspicion was Klein, the other agent, had taken Nick to abuse what powers he might hold. Gears turned in Ankar's head. He could just toss me out. His clawed hand flexed into a fist and relaxing again. Do not tell others of your relationship with Nicholas. They all shall see you as a way to get to him. Do not mention it, even to ones you trust the most. Is that clear? He growled in a low tone. I nodded, a bit confused why he would bring this up. So far that had never been an issue. I'd won him over in letting me try and help. I walked forward, the bigger man not making a move to stop me. We still need to leave. This is as far as we can go. There is a wall here preventing us from continuing deeper into the cave. Either we find a new entrance, or call an agent that can break this. Raising his hand, he placed it on an invisible wall right in front of us. The creatures didn't have any issues crossing through it, but Ankar wasn't able to break it. His knuckles appeared a bit raw, showing he must have tried while I slept. I kept walking forwards, carrying his jacket somewhat folded in my arms. He started to shout again as if I didn't hear about the wall. Ignoring him, I walked past where the wall should have stopped me. He stopped yelling to stare dumbfounded. Carefully, he pressed his hand out in front of himself, seeing the wall was still up. I'm human, I reminded him, muttering away. He went over to one of the corpses to pull out a very sharp and long tooth. Tossing the bloody thing over, it bounced off my chest. He ordered me to find where the spell for the wall was located, and to break it. The tooth slickened my hand from the blood. It took a few minutes to find the circle carved in a stone along the wall with odd words written along it. Ankar waited not very patiently as I pressed the tooth against the rock to carve a line through the circle. I expected some kickback. Ankar kept his hand on the invisible wall. The moment the circle was broken, a spark came from his hand instead of hitting the weak human who messed with the spell. As grumpy as he was, I had to admit he was skilled at magic. I doubted there were too many other creatures that could force a spell blowback in a different direction and barely flinch from it. We pressed on, ready to find what waited at the back of the cave. We came across more creatures, but he took over the task of killing them. He didn't even need magic, just a few crushing blows from his claws. Ankar was not the kind of person to mess with. I kept the jacket over my shoulders, looking like a cape on my smaller body. I almost gave it back to him. His ripped open shirt was a bit too much for me to handle. His body was completely made of raw muscle, and I felt myself getting jealous. If I was born with a better body, then maybe, just maybe, I could be more of a help. He noticed the stares and felt tempted to ask about it. Is all the blood making you ill? I have heard your stomach is weaker due to your species. He sneered after he'd turned a creature's face into paste. You throw up one time on a case and everyone hears about it. I'm going to start making Nick leave certain things out of reports. Are you flaunting yourself on purpose? I half teased. His eyes narrowed, not understanding what I meant. Staring at his bloody hands, he considered I was talking about them. Creatures did have different ideas when it came to what was attractive. He may assume I was jealous of his sharp claws instead of a stack of muscles. Unable to figure it out, he stormed off, not able to deal with the conversation. Even with all the stress, messing with him was a bit fun. Following behind, we traveled down the cave as the path started to open up. Ankar stepped carefully and silently. He could sense something ahead of us when I couldn't. I slipped along the rocks. His large hand caught my arm and lifted me off my feet, then set me down in front of him. He placed his hand on my back to keep me still, and we stood in front of a massive boulder that was blocking the opening to what we assumed to be the end of the cave. His other hand scratched spellwork on the rock almost as fast as I could blink. Whatever spell he used made it so we could see through the rock blocking our path while no one could spot us. The opening led into a pool of water with a small rocky island in the middle. Someone moved around along the desks and tables he had set up, his hair a mess and his face frantic. Cages of animals were piled off to the side. Most contained chickens, while other smaller ones were filled with rats. A person sat in a chair behind him, and it took me a second to notice how still they were. An opening in the ceiling flooded the entire place with light, causing odd reflection to ripple off the water. Off to the side was a sight that made me choke up. I opened my mouth and Ankar placed a hand over it to silence whatever cry of shock nearly slipped out. A square glass coffin lined with spellwork sat hovering in the air above the water. A person lay inside, hands at their side and a white cloth over their face. From the color of the hair and the pale tattoos that were showing, I knew it was my partner. I struggled wanting to get to him, But Anchor was smart enough to keep me still until he could see what was going on.